Hi, I'm Rose Beranbaum. In this program, I'm going to share with you some of my favorite tips and secrets for successful baking. And you're going to find that it really isn't very hard to create spectacular desserts in your own kitchen. We're going to begin by making a basic pie dough. I'm starting with 1 1/3 cups of all-purpose flour, and I'm adding to it some salt. The salt gives it a nice flavor. Pie dough is very flat if there's no salt in it. This is a pastry cutter, and it's an old-fashioned kind of tool. You can use a fork, but I'm using it to blend the two ingredients together, and then I'm going to add the first part of the flour. The secret for a really good flaky pie crust that is also tender is to add the first part of the butter, about 2/3 of it, in slices and very cold, and cut it in until it resembles very coarse meal. Now I'm using a total of 4 ounces of butter in all. There are some people who like to use shortening for their pie crusts, but I find you can get tenderness and flakiness and the wonderful flavor of butter if you use the right technique. It's easy to make a pie crust, but to make a really wonderful one, you have to make one fairly often. You can't wait a year before you've made your pie crust because you sort of lose the touch. The French have a great expression for that. They say, il faut mettre la main à la pâte. You have to put your hand to the dough. It's kind of like we Americans say hands-on. So as you see, I'm cutting it in, and because it's cold, it's taking a little while, but that's going to keep the flour from absorbing too much of the fat. What happens is that the butter coats the gluten in the flour, and it keeps it from absorbing too much of the water when I add it later. And it's water and gluten formation that makes for a very tough pie crust. Now there are other kinds of fats you can use. You can use just about any fat. Beef fat or suet, lard, makes a very, very crumbly dough. The more butter and the more short the crust becomes, the more it's going to fall apart. And you want a dough that you're going to be able to roll out and put into a pie pan that won't shrink, that will be tender and flaky at the same time. So the first part is going to resemble coarse crumbs, and it's just about that point now. And then I'm going to add the rest of the butter and cut it in until it's the size of small peas. The butter has been cut into slices, and then I put it back in the refrigerator for about an hour when I'm ready to make the pie crust. And that makes it possible to keep it really firm. The truth is that the best pie crusts are made in cool weather when the ingredients stay cool, but the most delicious pie fillings are in the summer, in June, when you get cherries and all the fresh berries. So many times what I do is I freeze the berries, especially cherries freeze wonderfully, even for up to 2 years. And later when I make a cherry pie, I'm going to be using canned cherries, so you do have that option as well. You can make a pie really any time of year. Pie crust can be made way ahead and frozen for months, and it keeps very well in the freezer. And it can also be kept in the refrigerator for at least 3 days. But you have to be careful to wrap it in plastic wrap or aluminum foil, because otherwise what will happen is that it will dry out. Now you notice that I'm working on marble here. And you certainly don't need to roll out a pie dough on marble, but marble manages to keep the crust very cool. Now this is the size of small peas, and I'm going to start adding the water. And the water should be drizzled in. The recipe is 3 to 5 tablespoons of water. On a very humid day, you might use less. If you've overmixed your fat into the flour, you probably end up having to use more. As I explained before, the fat coats the flour, preventing too much water from entering it. If you don't want to wait before rolling out the pie dough, you can use a teaspoon of vinegar. That relaxes whatever gluten is formed, and then you can pretty well roll it right away if it hasn't gotten too warm. So I'm going to start with 3 tablespoons of the water, because it never takes less than that, not at least when you're using butter. And I'm going to toss until the particles look slightly coated. And if I see that there's still a lot of dry particles left, then I'm going to add the remainder, maybe a tablespoon at a time. If it's just a tiny bit, I might add only a half a tablespoon. See, I'm tossing and lifting with a fork, and it's beginning to clump together, which is great, but I still have some dryness. And remember, adding too much water is going to make it tough. Pie dough is one of my favorite things to make. It's very satisfying, especially rolling it out when it has a wonderful consistency. But if you've ever made a pie dough that doesn't have the right amount of liquid, you'll know the frustration of trying to roll it out and watching it crack. If you've done it and it's reached that point, there's not much you can do except for starting again. If it's too wet, you can always add more flour. I actually like using a pastry cloth, which I'll be showing you. Now you can see that there's just a tiny bit of dry ingredient left. So I'll add less than a tablespoon of water. And now we're up to 4½ tablespoons, so it just was almost the 5 tablespoons. That was the maximum amount. So mash it together. Meantime, I've never touched it with my hands. The French use their fingertips to make what they call pâte brisée. That's pretty much the same proportion. But they only use the fingertips of the hand because that's the coolest part of the hand. Now, different people have different hand temperatures. Some people have cool fingers and some warm. So you'll know yourself, if you have cool hands, that it's just fine to use your fingers for the whole process. And now I'm kneading it together and pressing it. See, there's a little bit of dryness, but I don't want to get it totally wet because when you press it together, it will begin to adhere. And this is a very nice cold dough, which means that it won't adhere because the butter has started to melt. If you have Formica or any smooth top, you can now dump it out. It's much easier to work. See how it's all coming together very nicely? And I just knead it very, very lightly. At this point, use the heel of your hand because that's another cool spot. It's just this part in here that you want to avoid. Now, kneading will develop more of the gluten in the dough, so we don't want to overdo it, just until it forms a nice disc. And people say in some recipes to roll it into a ball. Well, it's fine if you start out rolling it into a ball, but when you're going to roll it, see now it's all holding together? When you're going to roll it with a pie pin, you don't want to have to roll it starting from the ball. So at this point, I'm going to wrap it in plastic wrap and then flatten it into a disc and refrigerate it for about an hour. And at the end of an hour, if the dough is warmed a little, it'll be just the right temperature for rolling. It will also have relaxed so that it won't start pulling back and stretching when you want to roll it out. It's okay if it's rough on the edges. After all, the edges are going to get trimmed. So now it's ready. And you can just slip it into the refrigerator, and there is your pie crust.